The laptop screen went black at exactly 3:47 a.m., and in that moment, Jessica Chen realized her entire empire was crumbling. 23 floors above the sleeping city, the CEO of TechNova Solutions watched helplessly as years of work disappeared into the digital void. The hackers weren't just stealing data, they were systematically destroying everything she had built, one encrypted file at a time. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts for someone, anyone, who could help. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. That's when she remembered the business card tucked away in her purse, the one from the quiet security consultant who had approached her at last month's conference with warnings she had dismissed as paranoid rambling. Marc Rodriguez had tried to warn her this would happen. The former Army cybersecurity specialist turned small-town IT consultant had seen the signs during their brief encounter at the Silicon Valley Tech Summit. While other vendors pitched expensive solutions and flashy presentations, Marc had quietly pointed out the vulnerabilities in her company's security infrastructure with the same methodical precision he had once used to protect military networks from foreign threats. Jessica had thanked him politely and filed his card away, choosing instead to trust her existing team of high-priced consultants who told her what she wanted to hear rather than what she needed to know. Now watching her life's work vanish in real time, Jessica understood the difference between expensive advice and valuable wisdom. Her fingers dialed Marc's number with desperate urgency, not caring that she was calling a stranger at nearly 4 in the morning, not considering that he lived 3 hours away in the small military town of Riverside where she had never imagined setting foot. Marc answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the hour. Years of military training had conditioned him to wake up ready for crisis, a skill that proved just as useful in his civilian life as a single father and freelance security specialist. "This is Marc Rodriguez," he said, already reaching for the laptop he kept beside his bed, instinctively knowing that middle-of-the-night calls rarely brought good news. "This is Jessica Chen from TechNova Solutions," came the voice on the other end, strained and fighting back panic. "We met at the conference last month. You said our security was compromised. You were right. They're in our systems right now, and I don't know how to stop them." Marc was already pulling on clothes with one hand while opening his laptop with the other, his mind shifting into the tactical mode that had kept him alive in 3 overseas deployments. "How long have they been inside?" he asked, fingers flying across the keyboard as he began remote diagnostics from his modest bedroom in the house he shared with his 8-year-old daughter Emma. "I'm not sure," Jessica's voice cracked. "I was working late, trying to finalize the Morrison acquisition deal when everything started shutting down. Files are disappearing, accounts are being locked out, and my IT team isn't answering their phones." Marc pulled up preliminary scans of TechNova's network architecture, seeing immediately what he had tried to explain to Jessica weeks earlier. Her company's security was like a fortress with a beautiful front gate and no walls. Impressive on the surface, but fundamentally vulnerable to anyone who understood how to look for the gaps. "Miss Chen, I need you to listen carefully," he said, his voice carrying the calm authority that had once commanded respect from soldiers under enemy fire. "Don't touch anything else on your computer. Don't try to save files or send emails. Every action you take right now gives them more access to your systems." "But the Morrison deal documents," Jessica started, her CEO instincts fighting against the advice even as her rational mind recognized the wisdom in it. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story." "Are already compromised if they wanted them," Marc interrupted gently but firmly. "Right now, we focus on stopping the bleeding. Then we worry about what we can recover. I'm going to walk you through some steps to isolate your network. But first, I need to know, is this just about money, or is there something else they might be after?" The pause that followed told Marc everything he needed to know. In his experience, the most dangerous cyber attacks weren't random acts of digital vandalism. They were surgical strikes with specific targets and sophisticated backing. The fact that Jessica Chen was hesitating meant this attack was personal, which made it infinitely more dangerous than simple corporate espionage. "There might be someone who wants to see me fail," Jessica admitted quietly, her voice barely audible over the phone. "My business partner, David Brennan, he's been pushing for changes to our company structure. He thinks I'm too cautious, too controlling. We've been having disagreements about the direction of the company. Marc's fingers paused over his keyboard as years of military intelligence training kicked in. Personal vendettas disguised as business disputes were often the most vicious kind of warfare, because they combined professional knowledge with emotional motivation. Miss Chen, I'm going to help you through this, but I need you to understand something. If this is an inside job, then everyone in your current circle might be compromised. That means trusting your existing team could make things worse. What are you suggesting? Jessica asked, though something in her voice suggested she already knew the answer. Pack whatever you absolutely need and get out of there. Come to Riverside. I have secure systems here, and more importantly, I have distance from whoever is doing this to you. We can rebuild your defenses from the ground up, but only if we can work somewhere they don't have access. The suggestion was radical, and went against every instinct Jessica had developed in 15 years of corporate leadership. CEOs didn't abandon their offices and flee to small towns when facing business crises. They stayed and fought, surrounded by their teams and advisors and lawyers. But sitting alone in her compromised penthouse office, watching her company's digital infrastructure crumble in real time, Jessica realized that conventional wisdom had already failed her spectacularly. "How do I know I can trust you?" she asked, the question hanging in the air between them like a challenge. Marc looked across his small bedroom toward the door where a framed photo of his late wife Sarah sat next to a drawing Emma had made of their family. "Because I have nothing to gain from your failure, and everything to lose if I can't protect the people who trust me," he said simply. "And because right now, I'm the only person offering you a solution instead of an excuse." Jessica Chen had never driven through small-town America at dawn, had never watched the sun rise over farmland and modest houses where people lived lives she couldn't imagine. The 3-hour drive from the city to Riverside gave her time to think about the decision she had made, time to question whether trusting a virtual stranger was the most reckless thing she had ever done, or the smartest. Her phone buzzed constantly with calls from David, from her assistant Lisa, from board members who had discovered the security breach and wanted immediate answers she didn't have. She turned the phone off somewhere between the corporate towers of downtown and the first rural exit sign, cutting herself off from the world that had defined her for the past 15 years. The silence was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. For the first time since she had founded TechNova Solutions fresh out of MIT, Jessica was completely unreachable, completely alone with her thoughts, and the growing realization that the life she had built might be nothing more than an elaborate house of cards. The address Marc had given her led to a neighborhood that looked like something from a television show about normal families. Small houses with front porches, mailboxes decorated with children's drawings, yards where toys lay scattered in ways that suggested they were used daily rather than arranged for appearance. Jessica's Tesla looked absurdly out of place among the pickup trucks and minivans, a reminder of how far she had traveled from her familiar world. Marc's house was painted pale blue with white trim, unremarkable except for the American flag hanging beside the front door and the meticulous way the small garden was maintained despite the modest surroundings. Jessica sat in her car for several minutes, engine running, air conditioning preserving the last bubble of her former life. Once she walked through that door, she would be admitting that everything she thought she knew about success and security had been wrong. The front door opened before she could make the decision to knock. Marc Rodriguez looked different in the morning light, less like the polished conference speaker she remembered, and more like someone who belonged in this quiet neighborhood. He wore jeans and a simple t-shirt, but something in his posture suggested military training that civilian clothes couldn't disguise. Behind him, a young girl with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail peered around his legs with the fearless curiosity of a child who had never learned to be afraid of strangers. "You must be Miss Chen," Marc said, his voice carrying the same calm authority she remembered from their phone conversation. "This is my daughter Emma." "Emma, this is the lady I told you about who needs help with her computer problems." Emma stepped forward with the formal politeness of a child who had been coached in proper behavior. "Daddy says you're very smart and built a big company all by yourself," she said, extending a small hand for Jessica to shake. "That's really cool. I want to build something important when I grow up too." The simple interaction caught Jessica off guard. In her world, children were abstract concepts. obstacles to productivity that required expensive childcare solutions. She couldn't remember the last time a child had spoken to her directly, much less with such genuine admiration for her professional achievements. "Thank you, Emma," she managed, shaking the small hand with careful attention. "What do you want to build?" "A hospital for animals that nobody else wants," Emma replied without hesitation. "Daddy says every living thing deserves someone to take care of them, even if they're not perfect or pretty or useful to other people." Marc's hand settled gently on his daughter's shoulder. "Emma, why don't you get Miss Chen something to drink while I help her with her bags? She's had a long drive." The house was smaller than Jessica's downtown office, but it felt more substantial somehow. Family photos covered the refrigerator and side tables, showing Marc and Emma at various stages of her childhood, often accompanied by a woman with kind eyes and Emma's smile who was notably absent from the more recent pictures. The furniture was comfortable rather than stylish, chosen for durability and function rather than appearance. Books were stacked on every available surface, a mixture of technical manuals, children's stories, and novels that suggested reading was a shared family activity. "Your wife?" Jessica asked quietly, nodding toward one of the family photos. "Sarah," Marc confirmed, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to speak about loss without falling apart. "She died in a car accident 2 years ago. Drunk driver ran a red light on her way home from work." The simple statement hit Jessica with unexpected force. She had assumed Marc's single parenthood was the result of divorce, the kind of messy personal situation that successful people managed discreetly with lawyers and custody agreements. The reality of sudden, senseless loss was harder to process, more frightening, because it suggested that control was an illusion and security was temporary. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it in ways she hadn't expected. "That must have been devastating." "It was," Marc agreed simply. "But Emma needed me to figure out how to keep going, so I did. We moved here from San Antonio because she needed stability, and I needed work that let me be present for her. Turns out small-town IT consulting pays enough to cover the mortgage and leaves time for school pickup and bedtime stories." Emma returned with a glass of orange juice and a plate of cookies that looked homemade. "I helped make these yesterday," she announced proudly. "Daddy says cooking is an important life skill because restaurants are expensive and home food tastes better anyway." Jessica accepted the refreshments with a bemused awareness that she was participating in rituals she had never learned. In her apartment, meals came from delivery services or catered business functions. The concept of baking cookies with a child was as foreign as speaking a different language. "They're delicious," she said, taking a bite and discovering that Emma was right about home food tasting better. "Miss Chen," Marc said, settling into a chair across from her, "before we dive into your technical problems, I need to understand what we're really dealing with. You mentioned your business partner David Brennan last night. Tell me about your relationship with him." The question made Jessica uncomfortable in ways she couldn't immediately articulate. David had been her mentor when she first started TechNova, the experienced investor who had provided seed funding and business connections that turned her innovative software concepts into a profitable company. Over the years, their partnership had evolved into something more complex, a relationship that blurred the lines between professional collaboration and personal dependence. "David has been instrumental in TechNova's success," she began carefully. "He provided the initial investment capital and helped me navigate the business side of technology development. Without his guidance, I never would have been able to scale the company to its current size." "That doesn't answer my question," Marc observed gently. "I asked about your relationship with him, not his resume." Emma looked up from her coloring book with the unself-conscious attention of a child who found adult conversations interesting. Jessica found herself speaking more honestly under that innocent gaze than she had in years of board meetings and investor presentations. "David wants to marry me," she admitted. "He's been proposing for the past 6 months, becoming more insistent each time I postpone giving him an answer. He says it makes business sense, that combining our resources would create opportunities for expansion that neither of us could achieve independently." "And what do you want?" Marc asked. The question was simple, but Jessica realized she had no idea how to answer it. She had spent so many years focused on what was logical, profitable, and strategically advantageous that she had stopped considering what she actually wanted. David was intelligent, successful, and devoted to the company they had built together. On paper, He was the perfect partner for someone in her position. "I want TechNova to succeed," she said finally. "I want the company to continue growing and innovating and making a difference in how people interact with technology." "That's what you want for your company," Marc corrected patiently. "What do you want for yourself?" Emma looked up from her coloring again, studying Jessica with the penetrating curiosity of a child who sensed important conversations happening around her. "My daddy says grown-ups sometimes forget to want things just for themselves," she offered helpfully. "He says that's why they get sad even when everything looks good from the outside." The observation was so accurate it took Jessica's breath away. She had achieved everything she had thought she wanted: professional success, financial security, industry recognition. But she couldn't remember the last time she had felt genuinely happy, rather than merely satisfied with her accomplishments. "Your daughter is very wise," Jessica told Marc, looking at Emma with new respect. "She gets that from her mother," Marc replied, his voice warm with pride and lingering grief. "Sarah always said that children see things clearly because they haven't learned to lie to themselves yet." Marc's laptop chimed with an incoming message, breaking the contemplative moment. His expression grew serious as he read the screen, fingers moving quickly across the keyboard in response to whatever information he was receiving. "What is it?" Jessica asked, recognizing the focused intensity that had replaced his earlier calm. "I've been monitoring your company's network remotely since you called last night," Marc explained, turning the laptop so she could see the data streaming across the screen. "The attack isn't random, and it's not finished. Whoever is doing this has been inside your systems for months, maybe longer. They've been mapping your entire digital infrastructure, identifying key vulnerabilities, and planning this assault with military precision." Jessica felt her stomach drop as she processed the implications. "Months? How is that possible?" "We have security protocols, monitoring systems, regular audits by certified specialists." "Who certified those specialists?" Marc asked quietly. "Who recommended them to you? Who had access to all your security assessments and knew exactly what measures you had in place?" The answer hit Jessica like cold water. David had handled all the security vendor relationships, had insisted on managing that aspect of the business because of his connections in the cybersecurity industry. Every assessment, every protocol, every defensive measure had been filtered through his recommendations and oversight. "David wouldn't do this," she said automatically, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "He has just as much to lose as I do if TechNova fails." "Does he?" Marc asked, pulling up another screen of data. "Because according to what I'm seeing here, the attack is very carefully targeted. They're destroying your personal files, your individual projects, your proprietary research. But the core business applications, the client databases, the revenue-generating systems, those are being copied, not destroyed." Emma had stopped coloring and was listening to the adult conversation with the serious attention she reserved for important information. "That sounds like when Tommy Peterson said he was my friend but was really just trying to get my lunch money," she observed. "Daddy says sometimes people pretend to care about you but really they just want something you have." The child's innocent comparison illuminated the situation with devastating clarity. Jessica had spent months interpreting David's increasing possessiveness and control as evidence of his commitment to their partnership. His insistence on marriage, his pressure to consolidate their business interests, his gradual assumption of responsibility for more aspects of company operations. She had seen it all as protective devotion rather than strategic maneuvering. "If David is behind this," Jessica said slowly, "then he knows I'm here. He knows I called you. He probably knows about every conversation we've had since last night." Marc nodded grimly, "Which means we need to assume that your phone, your car, possibly even your personal belongings are compromised. You're not just dealing with a cyber attack, Miss Chen. You're dealing with someone who has been systematically gaining control of your life while making you believe it was your choice." The realization was more terrifying than the financial implications of the hack. Jessica had built her identity around being a strong, independent woman who made her own decisions and controlled her own destiny. The possibility that she had been manipulated for months or years, that her choices had been illusions created by someone else's agenda, shook the foundation of everything she believed about herself. "What do I do?" she asked, hearing the vulnerability in her own voice and hating it. Emma looked up from her coloring book again, this time with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes possess. "When I get scared, Daddy says I should remember that I'm braver than I think I am," she offered, "and that asking for help doesn't make you weak, it makes you smart." Marc smiled at his daughter with obvious pride before turning back to Jessica. Emma's right. The first step is admitting that you need help, which you've already done. The second step is accepting that the help you need might look different from what you expected. "What does that mean?" Jessica asked. "It means that saving your company might require losing everything you think you know about your life," Marc replied. "And it means trusting people you barely know instead of people you thought you could depend on. The question is whether you're ready for that kind of change." The surveillance device was smaller than Jessica's thumbnail, hidden inside the designer phone case that David had given her for her birthday 6 months earlier. Marc found it using a radio frequency scanner he kept in his home office, a leftover tool from his military days that he had never expected to use in civilian life. The tiny piece of technology had been tracking her location, recording her conversations, and transmitting data about her activities to someone who had been mapping her entire existence with methodical precision. "How long?" Jessica asked, staring at the device Marc had carefully extracted and placed in a signal-blocking pouch. "Based on the model, probably since he gave you the case," Marc replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. "This isn't amateur-hour equipment. Military-grade, probably cost more than most people make in a month. Whoever ordered this has serious resources and serious commitment to watching you." Emma looked up from her homework at the kitchen table, where she had been working on a math worksheet while the adults dealt with what she had been told were complicated computer problems. The 8-year-old had the emotional intelligence to sense when adult conversations carried weight beyond their simple words. "Is Miss Chen in trouble?" she asked with the direct honesty that children brought to complicated situations. Marc considered his answer carefully. He had learned to be truthful with Emma about difficult realities, while still protecting her from details that would cause unnecessary fear. "Miss Chen trusted someone who wasn't trustworthy," he explained. "Now we're helping her figure out how to be safe and make better choices about who to trust. Like when I thought Katie Martinez was my friend, but she was just pretending so she could copy my spelling tests?" Emma asked. "Similar idea, but more serious," Marc confirmed. "Sometimes adults pretend to care about someone when they really just want to control them or take something that belongs to them." Jessica listened to this exchange with growing amazement at how a child could distill complex adult betrayals into concepts that made perfect sense. The comparison to a dishonest school friend was more accurate than any analysis she had heard from business consultants or legal advisors. Over the following days, Jessica discovered what it meant to live without constant surveillance and manipulation. Marc's house operated on rhythms that were completely foreign to her experience. Meals happened at regular times and involved actual cooking rather than ordering from expensive restaurants. Emma's school schedule created natural boundaries around the day that had nothing to do with business priorities or market demands. In the mornings, Jessica found herself helping Emma prepare lunch for school, learning to make sandwiches and pack snacks, with the kind of attention to detail she had once reserved for million-dollar business deals. The simple domestic tasks were surprisingly satisfying, requiring focus and care but offering immediate, tangible results that she could see and touch. Marc worked from his home office during school hours, methodically rebuilding TechNova's security infrastructure from the ground up, while Jessica watched and learned. His approach was different from any consultant she had worked with before. Instead of implementing expensive, complex solutions that required specialized maintenance, he focused on creating robust, simple systems that could be understood and managed by the people who actually use them. "Security isn't about having the most sophisticated technology," he explained while configuring new firewalls and authentication protocols. "It's about understanding your vulnerabilities and making smart choices about acceptable risk. Most breaches happen because someone trusted the wrong person or took shortcuts that seemed harmless at the time." Jessica began to understand that her company's security problems were symptoms of larger issues with how she had been making decisions. David's influence had extended far beyond cybersecurity, shaping everything from vendor relationships to staffing choices to strategic planning. She had interpreted his involvement as partnership, but from her new perspective in Marc's quiet home office, she could see the pattern of gradual control that had left her increasingly dependent on his judgment and approval. The revelation was both liberating and terrifying. For years, she had congratulated herself on building a successful company through her own intelligence and hard work. Now she realized that many of her most important decisions had been guided by someone whose agenda she had never fully understood. "I need to go back," she announced one evening while they were cleaning up after dinner. "I need to confront David, take back control of my company, make sure he can't destroy what I've built." Marc paused in his dishwashing, considering his response with a careful thought he brought to all important conversations. "What makes you think you can handle him differently now than you could before?" The question stung because it forced Jessica to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about her own capabilities. "Because now I know what he's been doing. I have evidence of the surveillance, proof of the security breaches. I can expose him." "And then what?" Marc asked gently. "You go back to the same office, the same board of directors, the same business relationships that allowed this to happen in the first place. You think exposing David will magically fix all the vulnerabilities that made you an easy target?" Emma looked up from her coloring book with the expression she wore when adults were discussing something she found confusing. "Why doesn't Miss Chen just build a new company?" she asked with the practical logic of a child who hadn't learned that starting over was supposed to be impossible. "If the old one is broken and has mean people in it, wouldn't it be easier to make a new one with nice people?" The suggestion was so simple and radical that Jessica felt her breath catch. She had been thinking in terms of reclaiming what she had lost, fighting to recover control of the life David had been systematically stealing from her. The possibility of walking away entirely, of building something new and better, hadn't occurred to her. "It's not that simple," she said automatically. "TechNova represents years of work, relationships with clients, intellectual property, financial investments. I can't just abandon everything I've built." "Can't you?" Marc asked quietly. "Or are you afraid to find out what you might build if you started fresh, without David's influence, without the constraints of the system he helped create?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Jessica had spent her entire adult life believing that success meant accumulating and protecting what she had achieved. The idea of voluntarily giving up everything she had worked for felt like failure, like admitting that she wasn't strong enough to fight for what was hers. But sitting in Marc's kitchen, watching Emma color pictures of houses and families that looked nothing like the corporate world Jessica had inhabited, she began to wonder if holding on to the past was preventing her from creating something better in the future. "What would I even do?" she asked, the question emerging before she could stop herself. "If I walked away from TechNova, started over completely, what would that look like?" Marc smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had asked himself similar questions and found answers that worked. "That depends on what you actually want to build, instead of what you think you're supposed to want. What problem do you want to solve? What kind of life do you want to live while you're solving it? Who do you want to be when nobody is watching or judging or trying to control your choices?" Emma added her own perspective, with the wisdom that children sometimes possessed. "Maybe you could build something that helps other people who have mean people pretending to be their friends," she suggested. "Daddy says the best jobs are the ones where you get to help people and feel good about what you're doing every day." The idea was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. Jessica had never considered that she could use her skills and experience to create something entirely new, something that belonged completely to her vision rather than someone else's agenda. The possibility of starting over felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether she would fall or learn to fly. That night, lying on the pull-out couch in Marc's living room, Jessica stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine what her life might look like if she chose freedom over security, if she prioritized authenticity over approval, if she built something that mattered to her rather than something that impressed other people. For the first time in years, the future felt like a blank canvas rather than a predetermined path, terrifying and full of possibilities she had never allowed herself to consider. The argument started over something small, the way most relationship-defining conflicts do. Jessica had been living in Marc's house for 2 weeks when she announced her intention to drive back to the city for a single day to retrieve important documents from her office safe. Marc's immediate response was to start planning the trip like a military operation, discussing routes that would avoid traffic cameras, timing that would minimize exposure, backup plans for every possible scenario. "I don't need you to manage this for me," Jessica said, her voice carrying an edge that surprised them both. "I can handle one day in my own office without a tactical assault plan." Marc looked up from the map he had been marking with alternate routes, his expression shifting from helpful concern to something more guarded. This isn't about questioning your capabilities. David Brennan has resources we haven't fully identified yet. Walking into a situation where he has home field advantage without proper preparation is tactically unsound. Tactically unsound, Jessica repeated, latching onto the phrase with growing irritation. This is my life, Marc. Not a military mission. I'm not one of your soldiers who needs orders and protection to function in the real world. Emma looked up from her afternoon snack at the kitchen table, her 8-year-old instincts picking up on the tension between the adults. She had learned to read the warning signs that preceded grown-up conflicts, the slight changes in tone and posture that meant she should make herself scarce, or risk becoming collateral damage in conversations she didn't understand. Maybe I should go do homework in my room, she offered diplomatically, gathering her apple slices and juice box with the practiced efficiency of a child who had navigated adult emotional storms before. Stay, Emma, Jessica said gently, recognizing that her frustration was with Marc's approach, not with the innocent presence of a child who had shown her more genuine care in 2 weeks than she had received from most adults in years. This isn't about you, sweetheart. Marc folded the map with precise, controlled movements, his military training evident in the way he contained his own reaction to Jessica's criticism. You're right, he said quietly. I apologize for overstepping. Your decisions are your own to make. The formal politeness in his voice was somehow worse than anger would have been. Jessica recognized the tone from her corporate world, the careful professional distance that people maintained when they disagreed, but couldn't afford open conflict. She had been hoping for partnership, for someone who would discuss options with her rather than making unilateral decisions about her safety and her choices. That's not what I meant, she said, frustration bleeding into her voice despite her efforts to remain calm. I don't want you to shut down and treat me like a client. I want you to understand that I need to make my own mistakes, even if you think they're dangerous. Even if those mistakes could get you hurt or killed? Marc asked, the question carrying weight that went beyond their immediate disagreement. Even if there are people who care about what happens to you and would be affected by the consequences of those mistakes. The conversation had shifted into territory that neither of them had explicitly acknowledged before. Over the past 2 weeks, something had grown between them that went beyond the professional relationship of consultant and client. They had developed routines and inside jokes, had shared meals and quiet conversations that felt like the foundation of something deeper and more permanent than a temporary business arrangement. Emma watched this exchange with the serious attention she reserved for important adult communications, understanding that something significant was happening even if she couldn't fully grasp the details. Her presence in the room served as a reminder of the stakes involved, of the reality that Marc's life included responsibilities and commitments that extended beyond whatever feelings might be developing between him and Jessica. I never asked you to care about what happens to me, Jessica said, the words coming out harsher than she intended. I asked for help with a cybersecurity problem, not for someone to take over making decisions about my life. Marc's expression closed off completely, the warmth and concern that had characterized their interactions replaced by the professional detachment he used with difficult clients. You're absolutely right, he said, his voice carrying no emotion at all. I'll prepare a comprehensive security assessment for your review, along with recommendations you can implement with your existing team. You should be able to return to your normal operations within the next few days. The shift from personal involvement to business transaction hit Jessica like cold water. She had wanted independence, had insisted on her right to make her own choices, but Marc's immediate retreat into professional distance felt like abandonment rather than respect for her autonomy. That's not what I want either, she said, hearing the confusion in her own voice. I don't want you to pretend that the last 2 weeks didn't happen, that we haven't become friends, that Emma hasn't been teaching me how to braid friendship bracelets and you haven't been showing me how to identify edible plants in your backyard. Then what do you want, Jessica? Marc asked, using her first name for the first time since their argument began. Because I'm getting mixed signals about whether you want my help or my distance, whether you see me as a friend or a consultant, whether what's been happening here has been real or just a temporary convenience while you figured out your next move. The question forced Jessica to confront feelings she had been avoiding since her first morning in Marc's kitchen. She had told herself that her growing attachment to the routine of domestic life, to Emma's innocent wisdom, to Marc's quiet strength and genuine kindness, was simply gratitude for their help during a crisis. She had convinced herself that the peace she felt in their small house was just relief from the stress of her corporate world, not a genuine preference for a simpler way of living. "I don't know," she admitted, the honesty feeling both liberating and terrifying. "I don't know what I want because I've never been allowed to want things just for myself. Everything I've ever chosen has been filtered through what was expected of me, what was good for business, what would maintain relationships, or create opportunities, or prevent problems." Emma set down her juice box and looked directly at Jessica with the penetrating stare that children used when they sensed adults were struggling with obvious solutions. "My teacher says that when you don't know what you want, you should think about what makes you happy and what makes you sad," she offered helpfully. "Then you pick the things that make you happy and stop doing the things that make you sad." The simple advice cut through Jessica's emotional confusion with devastating clarity. She had been happy in Marc's house, happier than she could remember being in years. She had enjoyed the quiet mornings helping Emma get ready for school, the afternoons learning new skills that had nothing to do with profit margins or market analysis, the evenings sitting on the front porch talking about everything and nothing while Emma played with the neighborhood cats. But she had also been terrified by that happiness, suspicious of it, convinced that it couldn't be real or sustainable because it didn't match any definition of success she had been taught to value. The idea that she could choose contentment over achievement, simplicity over complexity, felt like giving up on everything she had worked to become. "What if what makes me happy isn't practical?" Jessica asked Emma, as if the 8-year-old might have insights that years of business school and professional experience had failed to provide. "What if the life I want doesn't make sense financially or professionally or socially?" Emma considered this question with the seriousness she brought to all important problems. "Daddy says that money is important because you need it to buy food and pay for houses and doctor visits," she replied thoughtfully. "But he also says that having lots of money doesn't help if you're sad all the time, or if you don't have people who love you just because you're you." Marc had been listening to this exchange with an expression that cycled through pride in his daughter's wisdom, concern for Jessica's emotional state, and something deeper that he was trying not to acknowledge. "Emma's not wrong," he said quietly, "but she's also 8 years old and doesn't understand that adult responsibilities sometimes require making choices that aren't purely about personal happiness." "Like what?" Jessica challenged, sensing that they were approaching the heart of their disagreement. "Like the fact that I have a daughter who needs stability and security," Marc replied, his voice gaining strength as he articulated concerns he had been avoiding. "Like the fact that caring about someone means wanting to protect them from preventable harm, even if they interpret that protection as control. Like the fact that some risks are worth taking and others are just reckless." The conversation had evolved into something neither of them had planned, a discussion of fundamental differences in how they approached relationships and responsibility. Jessica had grown up in a world where protection often looked like control, where people who claimed to care about her had used that care as justification for making decisions on her behalf. Marc had learned to see protection as a form of love, a way of ensuring that people he cared about remained safe enough to make their own choices. "I need to go back to the city," Jessica said finally, the decision emerging from somewhere deeper than rational analysis. "Not to confront David or try to salvage TechNova, but to close that chapter of my life properly, to collect what's mine and say goodbye to what isn't." "And then?" Marc asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I don't know," Jessica admitted. "Maybe I come back here and we figure out what comes next together. Maybe I realize that what I've been feeling here isn't real, and I need to build something different somewhere else. Maybe I discover that I'm braver than I think I am, like Emma said, and I can create a life that makes sense to me, even if it doesn't make sense to anyone else." Marc nodded slowly, understanding that she was asking for something he found difficult to give, the space to make a potentially dangerous mistake without his interference. "If you're going back to the city, you're going prepared," he said, compromise evident in his tone. "Basic security protocols, communication check-ins, backup plans. Not because I don't trust your judgment, but because I care about you too much to send you into a dangerous situation without the tools you need to protect yourself." "That seems fair," Jessica agreed, recognizing the difference between supportive preparation and controlling management. Emma looked between the two adults with the satisfied expression of someone who had watched a successful negotiation. "Does this mean Miss Jessica is coming back?" she asked with the direct curiosity that adults often found uncomfortable. "I hope so," Marc said, looking directly at Jessica with an honesty that made her chest tighten. "But that's her choice to make." The next morning, Jessica packed the small suitcase she had arrived with 2 weeks earlier, adding a few items that had become meaningful during her stay. A friendship bracelet Emma had taught her to make, a pressed wildflower from one of Marc's nature walks, a recipe for homemade cookies written in an 8-year-old's careful printing. The additions were small, but significant, tangible reminders of a life that had felt more real than anything she had experienced in her corporate world. Marc drove her to the bus station instead of letting her take her own car, a compromise between his security concerns and her need for independence. The older vehicle would be harder to track than her distinctive Tesla, and public transportation would make it more difficult for David to predict her movements or intercept her journey. "Call me when you get there," he said as she boarded the bus that would take her back to the city and the confrontation that would determine the shape of her future. "Not because I don't think you can handle whatever you find, but because people who care about each other stay in touch." Jessica nodded, understanding that she was carrying more than her own hopes and fears on this trip. She was also carrying the trust of a man who had learned to love carefully, and a child who had taught her to see possibility in starting over. Whether she would prove worthy of that trust remained to be seen. The confrontation with David lasted exactly 12 minutes. Jessica walked into TechNova's executive conference room where he was waiting with lawyers and security personnel, placed a folder of evidence on the polished table, and spoke with a clarity she had never possessed before. "I know about the surveillance, the planned attack on my systems, and your systematic takeover of my company," she said calmly. "I'm dissolving my partnership with you effective immediately. My lawyers will handle the financial separation. Don't contact me again." David's response was predictably manipulative, cycling through anger, denial, and promises of reconciliation that might have worked on the woman she had been a month earlier. But Jessica had learned the difference between protection and control, between partnership and possession. She listened without responding, collected her personal files from the safe, and walked out of the building she had once considered her kingdom. 3 weeks later, Jessica was sitting on Marc's front porch when Emma's school bus arrived, watching the 8-year-old run up the driveway with a drawing she had made during art class. The picture showed 3 stick figures standing in front of a small building with a sign that read, "Chen Rodriguez Computer Help," in careful purple crayon. "I thought maybe you and Daddy could teach people about computer safety together," Emma explained, settling beside Jessica on the porch steps. "Like how you taught me that mean people sometimes pretend to be nice, but there are ways to tell the difference." Marc emerged from his home office, where he had been working on a cybersecurity assessment for a small business in the next town over. His consulting practice had grown steadily since Jessica's arrival, word spreading through the veteran community about his expertise and integrity. "What do you think?" he asked, settling on Jessica's other side and examining Emma's business plan. "Ready to help people who've learned they can't trust their current technology advisors?" Jessica looked at the drawing, at the hopeful faces Emma had sketched with characteristic optimism, at the home she had chosen instead of the empire she had inherited. 6 months earlier, she would have seen the suggestion as professional suicide, a retreat from real success into small-town irrelevance. Now she understood that relevance was measured differently when your work actually mattered to the people you served. Their new consulting firm specialized in helping small businesses and individuals who had been victimized by unscrupulous technology providers. People who needed honest advice more than expensive solutions. "I think Emma might be onto something," Jessica said, putting her arm around the child who had taught her to measure success by happiness instead of profit margins. "But only if she agrees to be our official business advisor." Emma's delighted giggle mixed with Marc's quiet laughter as the 3 of them sat together in the evening light, planning a future none of them could have imagined when a desperate phone call had first brought them together. Jessica had lost a corporate empire but gained a family she had chosen rather than inherited, work that fulfilled her rather than just enriched her, and a life that belonged to her rather than to other people's expectations. The small house at the end of Pine Street had become something more valuable than any executive office, a place where people cared about each other's genuine well-being, where success was measured by integrity rather than profit, where love looked like partnership instead of possession. Jessica Chen Rodriguez smiled at the sound of her chosen name, at the path that had led her from a compromised penthouse to a front porch where she belonged. Sometimes the best thing that could happen to a carefully constructed life was for someone to hack it completely, forcing you to rebuild from scratch with better security and authentic connections. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.